Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Emily. I'm the Senior Curator at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. Before we get started, a couple of notes. If you're watching on Facebook, welcome. Feel free to post your questions in Facebook and we'll transfer them to Zoom. For those in Zoom, you may post your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to try to ask the questions throughout, but we'll also leave some time at the end for questions. This exhibition, Hooked by Design and Related Programming, is supported by a generous grant from Jan Schley. This is the last weekend to see the exhibit, so if you're local, I encourage you to come into the museum. And if you're farther afield, we now have a video walkthrough of the exhibition on the museum's YouTube page. I'm delighted to be joined today by three of the artists in the exhibit: Tracy Jamar, Susan Feller, and Kris McDermet. A bit about them. You can see these are their works installed at the museum. Tracy Jamar is an artist, author, and textile restorer based in New York. She is the recipient of numerous awards and accolades for her hooked rugs, including 2 awards of excellence from the Surface Design Association and Juror's Choice from the Newtown Hooked Art Show in Connecticut. In 2017, she published the book Coils, Folds, Twists, and Turns: Contemporary Techniques in Fiber. Through her work, she strives to expand the possibilities of traditional handmade techniques such as rug hooking, collage, applique, and embroidery in diverse contemporary fiber pieces. Susan Feller is an artist, instructor, and author based in West Virginia. Susan is a self-taught artist who has been rug hooking since 1994. She's the author of Design Basics for Rug Hookers and also serves on the editorial board for Rug Hooking magazine, while also curating and judging international exhibits. Her work reflects the natural surroundings, contemporary environmental issues, and the historical tradition of crafts. And Kris McDermet is an author, artist, and instructor based in Vermont. She fell in love with the feel and texture, color, and vibrancy of wool over 40 years ago and has been working and innovating with the medium since. Over the years, she has added silk, crushed taffeta, velvet, and silk yarn to complete work that tells a story or represents nature's beauty. Her signature pieces often combine the techniques of hooking and braiding. So thank you so much for being here. My first question is, you all know each other. I know from doing this exhibition that rug hooking is a very close-knit community. Can you tell a little bit about your friendship and the groups that you're involved with?
I guess I'll start off. When I was thinking about it, I think all 3 of us met decades ago, thanks to the Green Mountain Rug Hooking Guild in Vermont. We've shown there, we've collaborated on exhibits through the years, also been to Souter Village Rug Hooking Week several times. And right now, thankfully, we're part of a collective called the 21 Collective, 7 different members from Canada and the United States working together to network our techniques. And thankfully, that was pulled together by Karen Miller out of Ottawa.
I'm in a couple other groups. One is called Hook Works Group. It's 5 of us. There used to be 6, but unfortunately we lost Beth Kemp. We haven't been able to meet of late, simply because of COVID, but in the beginning we would organize and find different places to exhibit our work, each individually. We didn't collaborate on work as so much as we did just combine our works to be in different shows. Then there's also something called the Textile Study Group of New York, which is not, I mean, it just includes just about anything you can do with textiles. We also can't be meeting, but they do have monthly lectures and whatnot, and exhibits as well that people contribute to, or usually if it's a group exhibit, it's defined by size because we all work in so many different ways, but it's pretty good to get together with a wide variety of people. It always kind of triggers other ideas.
And in Vermont, I'm involved in the Green Mountain Rug Hooking Guild, very active in our state. less so maybe during the last 2 years, but we still keep in touch and still meet virtually, if not in person. But in my hometown I live in Dummerston, but in Brattleboro, Vermont, I'm part of a group called Brattleboro West Arts, and we're made up of about 25 all kinds of artists. So there are several of us who work in fiber, they're painters, clay works, woodworkers, and we've been meeting now for about 10 years. We meet once a month religiously, and we have shows together. And so I like being part of a group of mixed artists also. And I think it stimulates all of us. We've been meeting on Zoom religiously again through COVID, and are about to start meeting in person again. So it's a really important group to me.
Nice. And all three of you have been working with this medium for a really long time. How did you first get started with rug hooking, and why do you hook? Why did you choose hooking as your medium? Does someone want to go first?
I can go. I'll go first, since I'm a little different. Well, actually, I started with rug braiding. And dear to my heart, in 1979, I really didn't know anything about rug braiding, and I don't have an art background, but I saw an ad, learn to braid a rug, and I thought, well, that'd be a good way to get to know people in a new community. And so my teacher, Isabel Clough, introduced me. I was in her first class, and during that class she said, I think we should all go learn about rug hooking, which I didn't know too much about, but had heard of it. And so she organized a class with Mary Shepard Burton, who lived near us. Mary had made the Noah's Ark. You might be familiar with her work. She has since passed away, but left a strong mark on we rug hookers. And during my first class, Isabel said, I've heard that people put rug braiding around rug hooking. And that got me in my first 6 weeks of learning to braid. So I feel I was at a great advantage of learning 2 art forms at the exact same time, and started combining them back then and have since. And I just adore it, love it all the time.
I guess I'll go next. I've always worked with my hands, and I used to do a lot of craft shows in Minneapolis, which is where I grew up in some of my formative years, doing macrame and beadwork and that sort of thing. I then, when I moved to New York, I became an antiques dealer there, but when I moved to New York, I started doing work at the Gallery America Hurrah that Kate and Joel Kopp ran. And since I had a sewing background, I started doing restoration, pretty much learning as I went. And so I started I did mostly quilt restoration, and every now and then a hooked rug would come in. But I didn't make my first hooked rug until my horse died, my first horse, Arrow. And so I used a lot of the t-shirts that I had worn when riding him. I cut them up. I mean, who could throw them away? Cut them up and hooked a rug. And it was actually, I got it in Rug Hooking Magazine as the first rug on the last page at one point. And then I just kept going. And truly the old rugs taught me a lot, just as the materials they used, how they used them, what worked, what didn't work. I then sort of got into, not sort of, I met Abby Vaquet. I had an exhibit out in East Hampton, Long Island, and she came and I met her, and then I went up to Shelburne took a couple classes from her, and she works in kind of wonderful, wild ways. So it all just kind of snowballed from there. But I pretty much for a long time worked on my own, but it's expanded since then, which is terrific.
And I pretty much did similar experience as Tracy, where I learned a lot of handwork and different crafts growing up. My mom made sure that I knew how to sew as she had sewn my clothing. My grandmother taught me knitting and crochet and embroidery. So I had I just loved touching textiles and fibers and combining them. But cross stitch and needlepoint, they're so unforgiving. You make a mistake or knitting, you drop a stitch and you're following patterns. So when a customer brought in an antique rug to be framed in my picture framing business, I too was doing a lot of handwork and restoration of samplers and such. So she said she knew how to hook. And luckily, instead of giving me a very complicated flower to learn, she taught me the 15-minute lesson, how to, do one loop and then the second one and not pull that first one out. And that's all I needed. Off I go to the thrift store. I found the wrong weight of wool, but it was 100% wool, and cut it up. And I finished the very simple pig pattern that she had given me in a month, and created a picture behind it. And that was it. That was 1994. And luckily my husband and I had decided to buy land down here in West Virginia and build a log cabin. And what do you put on your floors but hooked rugs? So off I went. Luckily, in drawing, I was inspired by the Fraktours, the Pennsylvania German folk art. So just the line drawings. And what I love about rug hooking is it's so forgiving. You can pull anything out. You can do it again in different ways. And you don't have to pre-plan your coloring, or it's easy to learn the materials and the tools.
I know you guys have some images to share. Where do you find your inspiration, and what's your favorite part of the artistic process?
I'll go. I think most of my inspiration comes from driving. I was an occupational therapist in my first career, and did home care and drove miles and miles. I love to drive, and it gave me plenty of time to look out at either the city or beautiful countryside and think about what I wanted to hook and braid. So I guess mainly that's where I come up with my ideas. Because I combine two art forms, I always look at an object and divide it into pieces so that I can braid around each individual piece, which is just how I work. So that's how I get inspired all the time. And what was your next question, Emily?
Oh, what's your favorite part?
Oh, my favorite part. Well, because I work in pieces, and sometimes there'll be, there can be 20 different pieces that I've hooked and then braided around. I think my favorite part is finally sewing them all together and hoping that they actually fit, because they always fit on paper. They don't always necessarily fit together when it's fiber, which is a moving kind of living textiles. And so sometimes I have to kind of hook a few extra pieces and finagle it a little bit. But I think putting it together at the end, even though I'm very thankful to have it be the small pieces, because then I'm portable and I can go anywhere with it, which I do.
My inspiration. At first I was going to say, well, gee, I don't know, but a variety of things. I like patterns, patterns in nature, patterns in just about anything. A couple of my early pieces that are in something called a Flyover Land series were the patterns down below. When you're in an airplane, I just find them fascinating, and the variety within them. I also am inspired by kind of things that happen in my life. I mean, my horses were part of it. Objects I find. I have a series I just finished, I'll show a photo of it later, based on rocks that I included. I never would have thought I would have done that 2 years ago. I wouldn't have thought rocks and rug hooking would have worked at all, but I really like combining a bunch of things. So sometimes the oddest object or thought or pattern will kind of trigger something for me. And I have to say, the best part of it, it goes through changes. I mean, I start out with an idea, and start gathering stuff, and you think you know where it's going to go, and then I get partway through it and I think, this is not working at all. What was wrong with me? What did I think this was going to work? And I get very discouraged. And I have learned, you just keep going. You can always change it later. Don't make any rash changes now. Just keep going, and then it clicks, and then I go on. But I have to say, I mount most of my rugs now. They tend to be smaller, or hookings, what everyone wants to call them. And so when I find I finish that mounting and I flip it around and see it all kind of stretched and stapled and stuff, that's the best part of it for me.
And my inspiration, thankfully, I grew up in a rural area in northwest part of New Jersey, and I've come back to similar situation here in West Virginia. So just looking outside, for me, it's the natural beauty of my environment that I want to share, and I want people to definitely think about the human impact on it. So a lot of my work is about what humans are doing to nature and how we, add straight lines to organic lines. But I love line, color, and texture. And I think I agree when your piece is finally put together and you can step back and say, I'm done, I'm satisfied. That's the best part. But oftentimes I'm working on something new then too. So I can just step aside.
So shall we share some images now? Kris, do you want to bring up your slideshow?
Okay. Certainly we'll try here. Okay, this first piece is, I think, it's a kimono, traditional design, at least the outside shape of it, and an obi on top, which is the sash that goes around the kimono. And I had always been intrigued by kimono, and was actually bought one at an auction that had never been sewn together. And so that got me started on the color. And traditionally, there is a diagonal piece, so I decided to make it a river. And then in that, I think I can enlarge, well, maybe I can't enlarge it, but inside the river, there are several hooked pieces. So what I love to do is go back and forth between hooking and braiding and hooking and braiding and keep on going. But this piece also illustrates how I think in small pieces first and then join them together. So there are 10 different pieces in the bottom in the kimono, and about 5, I think, in the top in the obi. But you can see that their braid is around. Here's one of the arm pieces. And then I was able to divide the body of it into 2 pieces with a river. So that's what I like. And what I was telling you about, it worked on paper perfectly. It didn't work so perfectly when I went to put it together. And I have a small little triangle right there. There was a big hole there where there just wasn't anything. And so luckily with hooking and braiding, I just hooked a little piece, sewed it right in. And even though you might be able to see that line, I think it just adds to the texture of the piece. And so the obi, I read that they're used as art now on the walls by some people. And so my design, even though a typical obi is one sash going in one direction so this is on the back, the woman's back, and then the sash goes off one direction. So I divided it in 2, and then the sash is always finished by some kind of cording. I used braid in this instance, and then a friend, Marta Birnbaum, made the beads. She's a bead maker here in Vermont. And yeah, so this goes on the wall, and it's 3-dimensional, a gusset on either side here. So it does stick out from the wall below. And the next one is, I like too telling stories about travel. And this was about a trip to China, where I read an article about something called a singing kite. And it's a folk art in China that is not so popular anymore, even though kite flying is popular. And so I read they are enormous kites that make a lot of noise because they are often covered with gourds. And so I think they're annoying to the population where they're being flown. It takes many people to hold them down. So this was kind of my version. These were scenes that we visited on our trip. And then the one thing I wanted to buy was a lantern, a Chinese lantern. And so this is a lantern with the map of China. And then the braid, again, thinking about always how I can combine both, is the tail of the kite, and the ties on the kite, the three of them, were a bird that was a pin in a museum that I saw there. And so the other two photos are just details of it, but each of the pieces are braided around. And the braid or the hooking, I don't like either of them to have more importance than the other, that they're both important. The piece always needs both in my mind. This catching the sky. Oh, go ahead.
Did you make sketches while you were there to incorporate into the rug, or did you bring
photographs? I took photographs. Yep, and then just drew from the photograph. This catching the sky in the mist of pink raindrops. I too like, you know, the social issues that are going on in our world, and this was my attempt at hooking and braiding parasol tops, which I am taken with, and what the environment is doing to beautiful parasol tops, to say the least of all the other things that it's being hurt by the air. And so the parasol down here in the right-hand corner was, I just dyed really dark values of all the other colors I used, and then hooked and braided it, and then took it apart. So that is my image of what the environment is doing. And the rest of it, this is silk, charmeuse silk in the background that I dyed and then fused to warm and natural. And then the parasol, the large parasol, which is about 40 inches, is raised up in the middle. So it actually undulates like if you think of an umbrella that's not fully open. And there are braids between each of the 16 sections, the triangles. And then these are all smaller with beads on them, made by, again, my friend Marta. And then lastly, during COVID, during the last 2 years, took a course in making jumchi felt, which is Korean felting with mulberry paper. And I had seen the exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston called Textile, and where they lit dresses from inside, and all just really creative styles and lighting. And I thought, well, you can light a dress, you can certainly light a rug, so to speak, not a rug for the floor, but and so I hooked the top and decided just to use simple colors and a simple design, but expand on it and not connect at all. And so it's in all of these pieces. Basically, they're nailed to the wall. That's how they stay upright, but the wall that's behind them becomes part of the piece. And then below, luckily my brother, Tim Matheson, is a lighting designer, and he designed the lighting that is behind the 3 layers of jumchi. And so amazing lights that look like a sheet of paper, but they're really LED lights, and come complete with a dimmer switch. And you can have yellow light or white light. So they're pretty, I'm intrigued with lighting in a piece now. And the last one, Map of Connections, is talking about how we are both connected and not connected. And sometimes there are perfect connections and other times there aren't. And so the 5 colors I thought was a good way to complete a circle and show connections, but then obviously all the pieces don't fit together. And so I tried to use both colors and textures and different fibers. And that's my current pieces.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall I go next?
Yeah.
Let's see if we can do this right. Oh, I always forget the share button and then the play. Okay. I had mentioned this before. This was I don't think it was the first one of my Flyover Land series, but it really kind of means a lot to me. I originally started with the lower left piece, and that was just going to be on its own. And then when I saw the kind of turquoisey blue lines leading off, I thought, well, they are obviously leading me on. And so I proceeded with the others in a counterclockwise direction going around. I started padding out. Each one had to have water of its own, water in quotes of its own. And the circles are kind of padded layers of wool in there, and shaggy stuff, and just it really is reminiscent of what you can see from an airplane up above. And I have to say, as kind of sad as some of the patterning is down below, knowing that it's kind of land that has been taken over by highways, or I don't know, big circular drums or nuclear plants or whatever it is, it really makes wonderful patterns to proceed with. This was something I did, well, and the date's right there. This started me on really combining a lot of different techniques with things. I worked with Jan Whitlock on a book called American Sewn American Sewn Rugs. And as part of it, I decided to try different techniques to see how they worked, how they looked, how they went. And what I found was that I began to really understand why some of these techniques were no longer in use. They were probably in use in the early half of the 19th century, because as I kept a log of how much of the material I used on the right side of each one and how many hours it took to do it. And as you can see, one of them I think took 54 hours. Now, of course, it wasn't a technique I was that familiar with, but the fastest one was needle punch, and that only took 4 hours. So if time was of value, you know, the less time you spent on something, the better it was. But I love the way some of them look, especially the one in the middle, the bias shirring, just absolutely loved it. And so decided I was going to use it, combine it with rug hooking and other things. Now I'm leapfrogging into something else. This is a piece that it's called Interrupted, and the subtitle is, it's an homage to Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. When I moved, my husband and I had moved to a house right next door to the Pollock-Krasner house out on Long Island, and I became a docent there in 2011. And I thought, well, if Jackson can splatter paint on the floor, I can certainly splatter bleach on the floor on a rug. Wouldn't that be bold and brave? So I had all these black t-shirts and I hooked them all up in different squares. And that was the Mark Rothko aspect of it. And then I scattered the bleach around, and I knew that bleach, when it hits black, it goes to many different colors. Depends on the colors that were used to make the black. And I would have no idea until the bleach hit it what color it would go to. So that's just bleach. And then the black square kind of off to the center on the left side was the Interrupted, because both of those artists, as wonderful as they were, I feel had their lives shortened and interrupted, one by suicide and one by an accident, but it was likely to have happened anyway. That then led me to another aspect. So I pieced together all these t-shirt scraps. I had black t-shirt scraps, and again applied bleach. All those colors are just bleach applied to the black. And I like circles and spirals and components. So I made this big spiral of things starting out with bleach put onto an eraser tip, and then working my way out to different sizes to a wine cork on the outside. Then I was afraid that the spiral was a little too undefined. So I stitched some metal cording on there, and it's anchored at each dot with a copper bead. So that was one of the larger pieces that I did. These are some of the smaller pieces I did. I really got into it. And the one on the left was probably the very first small one I did. The T-scraps in the middle was something I did for an exhibit through the Textile Study Group in New York, for an exhibit of things that went to Korea, where the textile had to be mostly red. And then the other one was just a small version again of that technique done with splattering bleach. This one is an exercise in, I don't know what it is, but I have to say it's one of my absolute favorites. I tend to get a lot of different kinds of fabrics, and this piece is pretty much made up of fabrics no one would ever really want to hook with. They're too thin, they're too weedy, the colors aren't especially nice, but when I worked with them with coiling and the bias shearing and the chenille shirring and hooking, I think you can make almost any fabric look good, depending on. And this one, it was originally a smaller piece, but I really wanted the idea that that lighter piece on the right was kind of floating on top of the other, which I have to say it floats for me. So even though they're all one piece and it's all flat. These were a couple other things as I worked on the book, The Coils, Folds, Twists and Turns. I started working more into things that were not specifically rug hooking, using some of these techniques and different fibers. On the left, that is mostly made up, the berry is mostly made up of cashmere sweaters. Whoever wants to throw those away, but moths just love them. And on the right, again, it is a whole selection of fabrics I really didn't want to hook with. And so I wasn't sure what to do with them. And so I just used them this way. And I found they worked really very nicely, because a lot of these techniques, you only see the very edge of the fabric. And I would hate to use up all that beautiful hand-dyed wool that I would have purchased otherwise for hooking, where I could only see the edge of it. So that's where I used some of the fabrics I really didn't like. Then I moved into doing some collage. Part of it was that I thought rug hooking is just taking too long. I'm in some shows, and so I want something that goes a little faster. And so these are images of my horse, one of my horses on the right. His name was 50-50. It says trio because at that point, I had 3 horses in my life. And there's little antique buttons, antique paisley, horsehair on there. And I just yarn. I mean, I just love playing with it. And in some cases, I'm sure we've all had wool that we've purchased that is just too pretty to cut up. So you just kind of save it and use it in that way. This is a piece that I did for the Textile Study Group of New York. It was called something by the yard, and everything had to be one length had to be 36 inches and then increments of either 18 and up to 36. And so I wanted to do larger spirals and use up a lot of cotton t-shirts that I had in light blue and mix in different things. So this was just kind of a random swirl. I love swirls. In fact, when I start a piece, sometimes I just draw a circle, a spiral, or something on the, I use monk's cloth most of the time and read off from there. I was given a pair of these shoes, not so that I could wear them. Someone had purchased them to give as a joke gift to a friend, and she had put a plant in one of them and gave it to her. And then the friend gave her the shoe back and kept the plant. And then she gave them to me. And I thought, well, let me do something with them. The toes and the heels are hooked. I have to say, it's fun doing the very first one, but after that, I didn't find it much fun to have to replicate something as precisely as I wanted it to be. And I didn't want to use linen or monk's cloth for the foundation for the hooking. So I used cheesecloth gauze. Never again. It was really torturous. I love the way it looks. I'm happy I did it, but I will not do that one again. My brother turns wood. And so he has a couple. I saw his workshop in a cabin in Wisconsin where we have a family cabin. And I thought, ooh, some of these would be so great to put some coils in or something else in it. So this was the first one. He routed out that area for me. And so then I put in the coils, which I'm very pleased with. The one on the other side is just a kind of, I think it was the beginning of my rocks. I picked up this rock. It had been broken in 2. It fit together. And I thought, well, I'll just use an antique paisley as kind of the thing that perhaps separated it, the fiber force, so to speak, and just made this fairly small piece. I won an award for it as the best sculpture, which I find very funny because, as you can see, it's only 2.5 inches tall, but I was pleased nonetheless. That was out in Guildhall in East Hampton, New York. And this is my last slide. These are what I'm working on currently. When the pandemic hit and I was moving out of the house in East Hampton and moving into my apartment back in New York, I had so many things I had to get rid of. And I had collected a lot of rocks. And I thought, how silly to take rocks to New York. So I tossed them all in the woods. And then I began to think, a rock is where you're safe. It's where you center yourself. A rock can be trusted. And I thought that's what everybody is looking now, is for their safety spot. So I thought, well, I will use these rocks And I had also at that point knit a lot of what's known as an I-cord, just these knitted tubes. I sometimes make a lot of elements and just keep them for when I might use them some other time. And so I started coiling these I-cords around the rocks, and things went from there. I've completed 24 of them now, and they are all mounted, but these are an example of 5 of them. And it has allowed me to use a lot of stuff that I would normally have just gotten rid of. Feathers, pine cones, wood, buttons. There's a black jet necklace down here that came off of one of my, I think my great grandmother's dress at some point. I've done macrame, beadwork, sequins, artificial flowers that I had at the house that were falling apart. All of it just was great fun to play around with it. And it just means I can add more and more things. I don't have to throw anything away anymore. I can just incorporate it into something else. And that's that.
Thank you, Tracy. We had one question from the audience.
Okay.
What was the metal that you used in the cording in the burrow fabric?
In the where?
In the cording, the metal cording, what kind of metal did you use?
Okay. What? I didn't use any metal cording for what?
In the burrow fabric, did you use metal?
Oh, I'm sorry. It was probably more metallic looking than let me just get out of this because I'm finding myself there we go. Okay. I was looking at my own screen. I think it was metallic thread. It was very soft and pliable. It wasn't a metal
Okay.
thing. Sorry for that confusion.
Oh. Susan?
Yes, here we go, trying to share screen.
Beautiful.
I'm going to go through process, and definitely it's my inspiration, as I said, just looking outside my window or going through the state. In this series, it's the Seneca Rocks, a beautiful natural outcropping in the middle part of West Virginia. People actually climb the rocks. I have gone up this path. So I actually took the photograph of this. I have no idea where that photograph is, but I can walk back. You could walk on this path and recognize this particular sketch. I do like to go from a sketch, and then over the last few years, I've been exploring my designs very carefully. So I will embroider them first because I really want to explore the lines. And then I may go into applique work. I have a lot of upholstery samples from a furniture store in Romney, Dillon's Furniture. Instead of them throwing into the landfill, I get all their stuff and then I sort it through. So I get textures and patterns and such. And I have incorporated hooking. So several of those trees are hooked, and then I start working in layers. And you're going to see a little bit of a change. This is work in progress. And I'm working on these layers. And you can see that the values had to change up. I replaced this central value a little darker so that I could give you the feeling of going back. And this far area is the rocks. And that very back piece is the lightest, giving hopefully as much depth as possible. So that's two versions of it. And finally, I was comfortable enough to incorporate a more realistic depiction of it using a lot of rug hooking and some embroidery and applique. I collect other people's absolutely fabulous pieces of wool, and I have no idea who this dyer was, but I have a beautiful piece of wool that I parse out very carefully. And it worked perfectly here with a little bit of embroidery work to enhance the distance of the trees. And when I got to the very back, the rocks are now painted, and the sky, the linen is a really tight linen that I was working on. So that too is painted. So I've achieved depth with a variety of techniques. This time, two pieces that are in the show, I went in reverse. I was so excited. I wanted to create a really large piece finally. We all share how long it takes to do our slow processes, But I had an invitation to be in an exhibit in Charleston at the Clay Center, and I knew that I needed a wow piece. So the final Trees in Our Forest is 36 wide and 78 high ish. And you see that I took it out into the woods that inspired it, just to see how I was coming along. The most important part of each of these explorations for this series was this, the background, the ground area. I wanted to depict it. And in this case, I took a plaid apart and I used the darker plaids for the shadows and the lighter plaid in the light areas. And I also created a pattern. So I'm hooking up to, over to, up to, over to. So there's a bit of a zigzag in the light section. That's why you see the diagonals. And in the darker section, it's mixed up with a lot of other fibers, and some of them are ragged. And it was quite a challenge to create the realistic bark. So in color in our trees that is hanging at the museum, that one is linear. It's more geometric. And then the third and fourth versions for this, I wasn't going to spend as much time on that big size. So I've reduced it to 16 by 12. It's about a quarter of the first size. And again, I worked in applique, just studying values and depth and patterning. And the final one, which actually is just as rewarding to me, which is embroidery work. Just those simple lines and understanding how to when you've added just a bit of texture. These two are an example of studying nature and leaves. In the first one, the leaves are, again, upholstery material that I've manipulated to bend and twist and adding some wire. But for me, the piece is most important is the background. This is shadows on the field and working up the colors and the raggedness. And then when you contrast with how I did the hickory leaf, very regimented linear work, just changing up my values and the angles on those. There's two different disciplines in being very free and realistic, and then depicting value and changing in a hit or miss. And I like both of them. The background on the hickory is painted for depth. For me, my most favorite or important studies right now are the mountaintop removal process here in West Virginia, the social issues of human impact. And I go to Google Earth a lot of times just to revisit a particular mining area. And I've used this image twice now. I like the time period that they took this image because it must have been early morning or afternoon. You can see the drama of the mountains. One side's very light and the other side immediately into those darks. So the shadows are happening. When I first looked at that Google Earth, I started sketching and I see leaves. I see a nice organic patterning, but I went more realistic in this particular piece and I sketched out a 20 by 20. But when I got halfway, I thought I had accomplished it. And why do I need to make it 20 by 20 when 10 by 20 will work? I've used a lot of pin loom weaving and stuffed them to make dimensional mountains. And then the rock areas, this one down here is actually a pin. And I'll show you where I removed that pin. And I put it up at the top. I thought design wise, that upper area was missing something. And by the title of the piece is Mountaintop Removal Puzzle. So I'm able to move the pin around wherever I want, which is kind of a statement about mountaintop. another example of Google Earth looking down on one particular mountaintop mining area. I removed the jewelry part, which is silver wire hooked standing wool. It's a separate brooch. It has a pin on the back. And when it is removed from the piece, you see the black coal that is the purpose for taking the tops of the mountains off. And the final piece is actually framed in Mountains of Energy. We do like our Starbucks drinks, and especially in the summer, we get straws, and I refuse to throw them into the garbage. So they're the perfect color for the pipelines that have been laid throughout West Virginia, creating a scar on our earth. And so I cut them up, and this is actually an image I drove past and saw that in the middle part of the state. And I have been incorporating mixed media for a long time. The iconic series that I created started in the turn of the 2000s with the neutral one. The American Folk Art Museum had a challenge to create something, Icons of America was the theme. And I thought our coinage was very important, and the Liberty Dollar was a great symbol. I didn't get this finished for that exhibit, and I'm happy I didn't, because I worked harder on manipulating the fabric into felting. I needle felted the fabric. There's some very dimensional sculpting and more embroidery work. So I'm really happy with it. It has received some awards. And then several years later, I always thought this would be a triptych. So the first one, it's depicting my grandmother's life. And the next one is myself in the 1970s, having a good time, believing in the ERA, and all of my Girl Scout badges. If you follow the yellow Girl badges to the center, they create a peace sign. And I finished up the triptych. My mother is very patriotic. She certainly has taught me to be respectful of everyone's votes. So I finished it up with the red, white, and blue piece at the end. And what do you do through 2020 in an artist residency, but you listen to radio and you take a lot of quotes down. So I created a lasting journal of that year for myself. And in doing that, I found the pieces are very meditative as I'm working. And in this process, it was difficult to work through each of the issues or decide which one to work on. So I've gone back to nature, and I'm really comfortable with, this is the New River that flows east to west in West Virginia. And the turquoise is embroidered. And then I'm depicting some of the mine areas in the organic shapes. And I have that's fall and winter, and I have just finished spring and summer. So my season's over.
Thank you, Susan. What type of paint do you use when you're painting on the linen? And do you have any issues with steaming the piece and the paint bleeding, or are you?
No, I use acrylic. I've been stepping along on that. So the last time that I painted, I actually gessoed the area. So the best advice I have, of course, is don't hook first and then paint. Do decide which parts you want to paint and then hook around it. That's helpful, because as you're painting, you're covering up the holes. And I thought I had it all worked out on my last piece, but I did have to hook through about an inch. It's not easy. So I have improved where I gesso and basically close up the holes first and then paint, so the paint is not soaking into the fibers, but I use acrylic.
And Tracy, the t-shirts that you use, are they 100% cotton?
Yes, certainly the ones that I put bleach on are. And I used to just kind of do a little dab of bleach on the inside of the hem of each one just to have an idea. And then I thought that's going to get me so obsessive with, do I want the orange here and the green there, that I thought it's just going to be random when it happens. But not to say that a mix of blend might work in if it's got a great color, but not with the black ones and the bleach, but the other things. Because I first started out hooking with t-shirts. The older the t-shirt. In fact, I walked up to a guy on the beach once and said, "I love the color of your t-shirt," and he gave it to me off his back right then and there. So I'm not that bold anymore, but.
And Kris, I know that you have some images of the braiding machine that you use. Would you like to share those?
I will. Okay. Well, maybe I'll explain this one first, just because it's next in line. So just talking about, I think we've all are inspired by nature. And I learned a great deal from doing this piece. I had been wanting to make something that was, when I'm on the ground looking up through a tree, and what do you see? And I, after I'd started it, I read the book, which I bet many of you have, called The Overstory, a great novel about trees and people. And so I took a lot of photos on my back and decided oak leaves were what I wanted to concentrate on. And I wanted to mention before that I've been part of a crit group, so a critique group. And they, the other women in my group, most of them had an art background. And so I brought my original drawing, showed it to them, and they all pointed out that in my original piece that I had big leaves on the top and some small leaves on the bottom, and how that couldn't possibly work. In real life, that the smaller leaves would be on the top. So I just wanted to mention I think the importance of being part of a crit group, where you go to it with the understanding that people might say, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? It doesn't look correct. And so this is a good piece for me. I took it all apart and put the smaller leaves on top, and then added little bits of color in the triangle between the three birds. And it's, again, pieces, all the leaves are done separately. I dye yarn and then braid around them, and then sew them on top of charmeuse silk. And so the silk comes from Dharma in California, Dharma silk, or fabrics. And it takes the same dye as wool does. So it really works well. And again, being inspired by nature, quite taken with the full moons of the year. And so it was a perfect way to combine braiding and hooking. So this is starting in January and then all the way around. And you can see as that becomes the harvest time of year, the colors. And then in the center, or the offset is the blue moon. And this is a wet felting. So I dyed a lot of silk and wool fibers, then wet felted it and cut it apart, sewed it on top of the rug backing. And then the stars are little metal stars I found, sewed them on, and there is, I can't really tell from here, but the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper are in there. And then I was going to, because when you hook and braid, I can go forever and make a house-size rug. And so these stars were going to be part of it. And I thought it's getting too big, and it's very heavy because it takes a lot more wool for rug braiding. So that I separated them into two pieces. Here, because most people aren't familiar with braiding, here are the various pieces of equipment that one can use. Some is old. This is a cutter for braiding strips. Most rug braiders tear their strips into varying widths. And this is a wool winder, because when I braid, or when all braiders braid, they roll their wool into rolls. and then the rolls dangle from this what's called a braid stand on the right. And it's held, and then it creates tension when one is braiding. And so these are old rug braiding clamps for tables. And you can braid forever as long as you have wool. You just keep sewing the strips together. And this is cotton splicing lacing thread and a lacer, which is braided rugs are reversible. So both sides, you get two sides out of it. And it's great. And then just some of the techniques. I think a lot of people have heard about braiding. It's gaining more popularity thanks to a woman, Christine Mangus, and the Valley Forge Rug Braiding Guild. So more and more people are interested, and some people are interested in combining both hooking and braiding. But this is how, again, I start. So I hooked this little heart in the middle, and then I braided around it. A separate piece, then I hooked these, kind of geometric shapes. I braided around that. So each hook piece gets padded and lined, padded with wool batting, and then lined with very thin suit weight wool on the back, so that the hooking and the braid are the same height if it were going to be walked on. Then I wet felted a big piece and then cut it into hearts, sewed it onto the rug backing, then hooked around it, padded and lined it, then added a row of braid, because you have to finish with a row of braid. And then I thought, well, that wasn't enough. And so I hooked all these small circles and then braided around it. And the reason I like this photograph is because the process in rug braiding where you join the start end and the finished end is called butting, B-U-T-T-I-N-G. It's kind of an involved process. There's a lot of hand sewing in rug braiding. And so this, I think, is a good example of that. And I was quite taken with a labyrinth. And so my husband and I, Stuart and I, built a labyrinth made a labyrinth in our yard. And it's a 7-path walking labyrinth where the white in this little diagram on the left is what you walk on. That's the path. And then the lines are the walls. So here are the paths. You start in path number 3 and enter the labyrinth. And if you follow it, I won't do it, but you go back and forth and you eventually end in the very center. And so the braid are the walls of the labyrinth, and the hooking are the foot paths or the finger paths. It's about 5.5 feet. I made it in the hook part in 3 different sections, and then cut it all apart, padded and lined it, and then inserted the braid, sewed the braid on. And the finished piece is this. So as I said, it's about 5.5 feet. And I always had loved this part of this poem. I go to nature to be soothed and healed and put my senses in tune once more, by John Burroughs. And so that became part of it. And then should I go to what's next yet, Emily, or stop here?
Maybe we'll stop at the labyrinth, since that's such a resting
Okay.
image, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yep.
Also, I think
Thank you.
So thank you guys. We're actually coming to the end of the hour. And I just want to say thank you. It's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful hour. You're all so incredibly talented, and it's been wonderful having your work in the museum. This program will be on our YouTube page pretty shortly afterwards, if you want to reference it for anyone in the audience or anyone on Facebook, or you want to share it with your friends. The program we offer them for free, but we always appreciate donations, which you can make on the museum's webpage. But again, we're just really grateful to have these artists here and in the exexhibition. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you,
It was
Emily, and
wonderful.
thank you to Joyce Kruger
Thank you, Joyce.
Yeah.
for getting us together.
Very much.
Okay, well, I'll leave it open a little bit longer. You're getting lots of love in the chat. Thank you. This was fascinating. Really appreciated hearing the amazing artists talk about their work. Thanks so much. This is great. It's been really nice.